Mr. President, I rise today to follow our Chairman, Senator Barrasso, to further discuss an important piece of infrastructure legislation that he's outlined that will positively affect the states of every member of this body, I want to encourage each of our colleagues to support it. Over the course of August and early September, the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee reached an agreement with our counterparts in the House to advance America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. Our chairman, John Barrasso, and I co-authored this bill and did so with the invaluable help of both minority and majority staffs of the Environment and Public Works Committee over the better part of this past year. I want to take a moment again to thank our chairman, as I have earlier, thank our chairman for his leadership. I want to thank the chair and the ranking members of the Infrastructure Subcommittee of EPW, Jim Inhofe and Ben Cardin, for their leadership and in producing this critical bipartisan legislation. I also want to thank the members of their staffs, and especially majority and minority member of the EPW staffs, without whom this bipartisan bill would not be before us today. And collectively, you've all done a terrific job, and I'm proud of you. As we say in the Navy, bravo Zulu. Bless you. Bravo Zulu, which means well done. As some of you may recall, the Senate's version of the bill was reported out of the Environment and Public Works Committee unanimously a few months back. And on September 13th, the bill passed the House of Representatives unanimously on a voice vote. People say to me back home, why can't you just work together? Well, in this case, we have. And I think the results speak for themselves. And I'm hopeful and I'm encouraged that this bill will receive the same strong support in the Senate this week. In a Congress and a country that are all too often divided, it's just refreshing to me, I think it probably is to others, that we've been able to come together to authorize water infrastructure and drinking water programs that are both vital and critical to the American people's way of life. America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018 is a win-win, both for our nation's economy and for our environment. This bill should serve as a model for how we can get that meaningful legislation done in Congress, and I hope that it will serve as a model. This legislation supports the ongoing work of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It does so by reauthorizing the Corps' programs for flood control, for beach and shoreline maintenance, and for the maintenance of inland and coastal waterways through which the goods that enter or depart from American ports travel. The Corps' Civil Works program is our nation's largest, and I believe the world's biggest water resources undertaking. This program addresses a wide variety of priorities, including ship navigability, flood risk management, beach and shoreline protection, renewable energy like hydropower, water supply, and environmental restoration and stewardship. In fact, over 99% of U.S. overseas trade moves through the waterways that the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is responsible for maintaining. Think of that, 99%. In fact, this bill supports the Corps' operation and maintenance of 13,000 miles of commercial deep draft ship channels and 12,000 miles of commercial inland waterways. These ports and waterways serve a combined 40 states, and they transport much of our country's waterborne cargo. The new authorizations that this bill provides are critically needed. Much of the infrastructure that the Corps is responsible for across our country now exceeds its useful lifespan. As a result, we have an enormous construction backlog of needed infrastructure investments. The latest estimates from the Army Corps indicate the overall construction backlog is in the neighborhood of $96 billion, while the annual budget of the Army Corps hovers around $4.6 billion. Think of that. $96 billion on the one hand, $4.6 billion on the other hand. Those two numbers reflect the extraordinary change that the Army Corps faces, a challenge that we began to address with this legislation. This bill starts to address that backlog by providing new tools that will allow government to partner with the Corps and leverage existing resources to make sure that we get the most bang for our bucks. This legislation also increases local participation transparency, and accountability in developing the Army Corps' annual budget. It's my hope that enhanced local participation will allow for a more transparent and a long-term look at the Corps' activities and help build a greater groundswell of support for increased appropriations to fund the agency's initiatives. The measure before us also authorizes critical Corps of Engineers disaster programs. When disaster strikes, the federal government often steps in and helps, as it did last year in Puerto Rico, in Florida, Louisiana, in Texas, and this year in the Carolinas. And a large part of that help is provided by the Army Corps of Engineers, something that may come as a surprise to a whole lot of Americans who don't realize the critical role that the Corps plays in responding to all sorts of emergencies. In addition, this bill includes new authorities to help bolster communities and ecosystems in coastal states like Delaware, like Maryland, and states across our country from some of the worst impacts of extreme weather events. This measure includes provisions that allow communities to recover more quickly, too, when disaster does strike, and facilities rebuilding in ways that are more resilient to future storms. This legislation also makes key changes in emergency response, in post-disaster recovery, and resiliency efforts so that the Army Corps thinks long-term instead of short-term when it selects the solutions that it implements. But the bill goes even further. It enables the Corps to pursue the best possible solutions to make communities more resistant to storm damage, whether those solutions are a traditionally constructed levee or a natural alternative, like the reconstructed dunes that we're using along the Delaware coast and in other places too. Earlier this year, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, which we affectionately call NOAA, announced that the total cost for extreme weather and climate change in 2017 exceeded $300 billion. That's a new U.S. annual record. $300 billion, 1 year, last year. It's not a matter of if the next extreme weather event is coming. It is a matter of when. Storm events such as Hurricane Florence grow more powerful, more prevalent, threatening American lives and infrastructure. The passage of this bill, a bill that will help protect coastal communities from the risks of flooding, has never been more important. In addition to strengthening key Corps programs, this bill also addresses key programs at EPA for major drinking water and wastewater needs across our country. For the first time in over 20 years, this bill reauthorizes the Drinking Water State Revolving Loan Fund, too. That program provides federal assistance to help communities with clean drinking water. It does so through no interest or low interest and forgivable loans that help communities in a variety of ways gain access to capital that would otherwise be unavailable. It's my hope that one day we could eventually add grants back into this program for communities that need the help the most. But that's probably a longer conversation for somewhere down the line. The ongoing crisis in Flint that we're now seeing play out in far too many communities across our country is tragic. But you know what else? It's avoidable if we invest in water infrastructure more wisely. And this bill makes it clear that we've learned our lesson. We're beginning to take some steps to address this enormous challenge. Some of our colleagues may recall that earlier this year, Senator Duckworth and I hosted a drinking water roundtable here on Capitol Hill. The image of her holding up in her hand a baby bottle with formula made from contaminated drinking water is an image that's hard for me to forget. This bill authorizes more resources for EPA to make sure every parent, no matter what their zip code is, where they live, can be confident that the water coming out of their tap at home or at their children's school is safe for their kids to drink. And toward that end, this legislation not only reauthorizes the Safe Drinking Water Revolving Loan Program, it nearly doubles its funding. By fiscal year 2021, the program will grow from its current authorization of $1 billion to almost $2 billion. Perhaps most notably, especially in light of the avoidable devastation and tragedy that we saw in the wakes of Hurricane Maria and Harvey, This bill authorizes $100 million to repair drinking water systems damaged by storms and creates a new program that helps protect drinking water systems from extreme weather events. This legislation also allows states to detect contaminants in drinking water to provide assistance to residents who depend on private water wells. This provision should matter to every member of Congress whose residents rely significantly on wells for their water consumption needs, and we have them in every single state across America. I don't know about other states, but 1 in 6 Delawareans depend on private wells for their drinking water. 1 in 6. It's just not fair that if contaminants end up in their water through no fault of the resident has to find a way to rectify that situation on their own. Without this bill, these taxpayers get no support. That's just not right. And this bill goes well beyond just addressing emergency situations. It provides a framework for updating and expanding water infrastructure systems throughout our country at both the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers. As I mentioned earlier, the bill authorizes $50 million for technical assistance to help schools and daycare centers deal with lead contamination in their drinking water, and another $5 million per year in grants for monitoring, for testing, and replacing the lead components that are causing water contamination. This provision is going to be particularly helpful in places like Chicago, like Baltimore, where there are schools operating with, get this, no usable drinking water fountains. Oftentimes, our water infrastructure is the forgotten leg of the infrastructure school. We rightly worry about the infrastructure we can see, like bridges, like highways and airports, like railroads. But our water infrastructure, our pipes, our shipping channels, our flood control structures, the infrastructure we don't see, but we rely on every day, is also in desperate need of investments in many parts of America. Before I yield the floor today, I want to again thank our chairman, Senator Barrasso, and again our senators from Maryland and Oklahoma, who are the co-chairs of the Infrastructure Subcommittee on Environment and Public Works, and other members of our committee, and frankly those who aren't fortunate enough to serve on our committee. But I want to thank them for their hard work through this process. I also want to thank our colleagues over in the House, Congressman Schuster, DeFazio, Walden, and Pallone, who are great partners of ours. You know, when we work together as Democrats and Republicans in both chambers, we're stronger. And when we're stronger here, we're stronger across our country. Finally, I want to thank Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Army, R.D. James, who's made this legislation a real priority for the Army Corps, for the administration. He and his team worked with us to craft a bill that I think we can all be proud of, and I am. I want to mention again, as smart as John Barrasso and I are, and the other senators who serve on our committee and here in the Senate, this bill wouldn't be before us if we didn't have some really smart people on our staffs. One of them sitting right here next to me today, and some others are standing behind me. And I see over on the Republican side, the majority side, there are some just terrific members of the staff who work under the leadership of our chairman. But I want to take a moment, take my hat off. I wish I were wearing my hat, but if I were, I'd take it off to all of you as well. Well, let me end today with an African proverb that I think is particularly relevant here. It goes something like this: if you want to go fast, travel alone. If you want to go far, travel together. And by working together, we've crafted legislation that's both substantive and needed. This proposal stands as a timely example of how we can set aside our differences, get meaningful work done for the people who sent us here, and expect us to accomplish really important things like this on their behalf. So, Mr. President, the underlying bill before us is one that delivers a lot of good for the American people, and at the same time represents good public policy that is fiscally responsible. It's deserving of the support of our colleagues here in the Senate, and I hope they will join us in supporting its passage. And with